Chapter 5. Your Kind Slaughter Ours. Sparks flew in the training room as Elthrendil and the Maiden clashed blades. The dark eyes of the Fae bore into the Maiden with a hardened intent. She had learned much in recent weeks, but this was the test. "Direct all the strength in your muscles and every thought into your mind into this," he'd said. "Make me bleed by whatever means necessary." The Maiden was hesitant, but decided to oblige him. Quickly, the hesitation dissolved into fear as Elthrendil closed the gap between them like a diving hawk. The bastard sword sang as it tasted the Maiden's flesh. A spray of crimson flew from her exposed arm, painting the gravel floor below her, as in tandem she cried out in pain. On instinct, she attacked the Fae to find he was not there. The air that once held him was empty, movement out of the corner of her eye. The Fae had somehow moved behind her. Using her own speed, the Maiden mounted a desperate defense. A dragonfly at midnight was easier to track than this Fae. Although she was fast, the Maiden realized the primordial blade was far beyond her. Sometimes the only warning of his strikes was the whistling of the wind. The Maiden fell deeper into her desperate dance. Her sword and shield sang in chorus as they parried Elthrendil's strikes. Whistle then block, flash then parry. There was no time for thinking. Yet she caught Elthrendil's face amongst the chaos. That simple, vexing smirk remained plastered on his face even now. "Is there a point to this?" the Maiden cried as Elthrendil backpedaled from her. The warrior bounced on the balls of his feet, flicking his sword from one hand to the other as he surveyed his student. His armor was clean, untarnished, while hers bore his masterwork. "If you can bleed me, then you can bleed anybody," Elthrendil replied. The Fae arched his back, stretching nonchalantly as the Maiden raised her shield. She thought that if she could catch his hand or foot, that might be enough to draw blood. His body was too well defended, but maybe he'd get sloppy. "It is a shame. Ishin opined about your readiness last sunset. I told our goddess that some birds take longer to fly." Then he looked at her with the eyes of a murderer. "Sometimes they never fly at all. They're eaten in the nest. Perhaps that's you?" The Maiden's eyes went wide with realization. This was the final test? She stopped her approach as a grimace spread across her face. It felt like there was still so much for her to learn. The Maiden was nowhere close to Elthrendil's skill, but perhaps that was the point. The Fae had given her training, the best training he had, and yet Elthrendil would never let her win. There was no way she'd draw a drop of his blood or achieve any task he put in front of her. Elthrendil didn't want her to leave, she determined. However, the Maiden had forgotten an important lesson Elthrendil had taught her. Never take your thoughts from your opponent in battle. As her concentration lapsed, Elthrendil attacked again. His foot slammed into the ground, which propelled him into the air. The Fae twirled, his sword glinting in the light, before he fell upon the Maiden again. A vibration shot up the Maiden's arm as the impact of Elthrendil's sword made her limb go numb. The Fae smiled. He did not retreat out of her reach. Elthrendil left no distance between himself and the Maiden's shield. He was so close that the Maiden could smell his breath, as the scent of it, something akin to evergreens, filled her nostrils as he began stabbing around her shield. The Maiden cried out as the metal found its way into the gaps between her ribs. She tried to go on the offensive, but Elthrendil danced like a leaf in the wind. He knew all her strikes, every single move, because he had taught her all of them. It was child's play to him. A step right, 2 steps left. What small prices to pay for complete safety. With a cry, she attempted to slam her shield into his stupid, smirking face. The smirk never moved on the Fae's face as he pirouetted around the attempt while simultaneously flicking his sword. The grimy leather straps of the Maiden's shield snapped away from her arm. She felt her defense fall to the gravel ground. "Hide no longer," Elthrendil said. "Every autumn brings a harvest." "This isn't fair," the Maiden said without emotion in her voice. "The scythe does not care what is fair to the wheat." Elthrendil moved forward again. His form danced left and right, shifting unpredictably before his blade lunged forward. The Maiden began stumbling backward as her fraught defense frayed with each passing second. The strikes were coming quicker now. Each one deteriorated a different aspect of the Maiden's form. Her elbows began to drop. Legs started slowing. The grip on her sword began dubious at best. This wasn't just about winning. Elthrendil was destroying her. He was annihilating the house he'd built brick by brick. Once there was nothing left, that is when he'd end it. The Maiden saw the truth in Elthrendil's eyes. Elthrendil saw the Maiden realization. Wham! The Fae slammed the pommel of his sword into the Maiden's nosy. She stumbled back, blood gushing into her mouth, as Elthrendil Elthrendil aligned her stab. The maiden knew her stance was broken and her balance was lost. There was no way to avoid what was coming next. It was ironic how bad the maiden was at avoiding her problems. In that moment, she felt the weight of her experiences crash down upon her. Out of 1,000 people in the maiden's position, most would not have been her getting torn apart. They would have been like Nicholas, keeping their head down and out of trouble. The maiden had to be the fool who took walks to get flowers from bastards who hated her. Everything she did caused more problems, and that's when it hit her. In that training room, halfway through Elthrendil's lunge, as she was about to be impaled, the maiden realized she was fantastic at causing problems. When she tried to help Ishin, she caused problems. Every time she tried to help anybody, things just got worse. Now the maiden was trying to help herself, and shockingly, nothing was getting better. Maybe monsters weren't capable of improving the world. They were made to destroy it. The maiden stopped focusing on helping herself. She allowed her left leg to fly into the air and be chopped off by Elthrendil's swing. The metal of the masterwork blade hewed through her bones and sinew like paper, but it did leave Elthrendil stunned. The force of the impact spun the maiden around. Then, using the moment, she brought her sword around in a wild slash. Elthrendil's smirk left his face. He brought his sword up to parry but was thrown back by the force of the swing. The Fae flew backward through the air, landing gracefully in the center of the training air. He'd miscalculated the maiden's strength. Best of all, as the maiden looked at him, the smirk was still gone. As energy surged through her body, the maiden took a leap of faith. Well, it was really a step. She knew it was the right decision when a freshly regenerated left leg touched the gravel floor. The cool stone tickled her newly formed skin as she first walked, then ran at Elthrendil. All the rules were thrown out the window as she mixed feeling with form. Elthrendil began to dance with her, following her lead for once, as the attacks arced toward him. The maiden tracked the Fae's black and orange hair as she rained attacks down upon the Fae. Elthrendil was patient as he allowed the maiden to keep pushing forward. Then, the maiden watched as he dug his heel into the gravel. She watched Elthrendil bat aside one of her slashes, then stabbed at her heart. His eyes went wide as the maiden stepped into the attack, letting the blade pierce her sternum. Then, with one hand, the maiden grabbed Elthrendil's blade. She watched the Fae struggle to pull the blade free of her hold. A wicked smile flashed across the maiden's face as she realized that, at least physically, she was smaller than this lithe Fae fencer. With her other hand, the maiden swung her sword at her mentor's arm. The Fae relented, giving up his blade, as he ducked underneath the attack. Without missing a beat, the maiden loosed another combination of slashes with Elthrendil's sword sticking out of her like an arrow in a target dummy. The Fae gave her distance, retreating well beyond the range of her sword with his blinding speed. Then, once he was away, the maiden grasped the handle of Elthrendil's sword and pulled it free of her body. Blood and viscera shot from the gaping wound for a few moments before the flesh healed itself. The maiden did not notice. She was focused on a weaponless Elthrendil, who stood panting on the other side of the training grounds. His smirk was still gone. Sweat ran through his normally perfect hair. "Perhaps you are like the Talbir," Elthrendil said through his panting. "The what?" "A weasel," Elthrendil clarified, "that makes its home on the Ring of Dreams. The longer it lives, the deeper it tends to burrow into caves. A part of its life cycle is that it eventually grows deaf. Perhaps you are part Talbir because I said if you can bleed me." "Mr. Elthrendil, I don't want to bleed you. I have your sword." To emphasize her point, the maiden shook Elthrendil's blade in her hand. "You can't defend yourself. I don't think Ishin would like it if I hurt you. I wouldn't like it." "Not all clouds mean rain," Elthrendil said, the smirk returning. In the blink of an eye, the Fae was closing in on the maiden. On instinct, the maiden swung her swords. Elthrendil let out his breath and became fire. His form became that of bright green flames which churned with a savage heat. The Fae's features became obscured, vaguely humanoid, as the flames swirled around him. The room filled with the smell of burning evergreens as the maiden's swords passed through Elthrendil's fiery form. Then, in a heartbeat, the Fae had become flesh once again. One of his hands shot forward, grasped the guard of his blade, and wrenched it from the maiden's grasp. The fingers of the warrior burned to Maiden at their touch while also feeling as strong as mithril. Something had changed within the Fae. The maiden attacked his near shoulder, hoping to put him on the defensive once again, but Elthrendil predicted her aggressiveness. A sickly sweet smell began to momentarily waft from Elthrendil. It made the maiden's mouth water and her stomach rumble. The smell was better than anything Ishin had ever cooked, the maiden thought blasphemously. Then she detected a growing of energy within Elthrendil. It started at his toes, then worked its way up to his belly, then through his arms, and finally it began to rush into into his sword. Although she could feel it, neither the sword nor Elthrendil himself displayed signs of this change. When her blade collided with Elthrendil's, it evaporated like chalk being dropped from a tall building. Particles of metal, once tempered steel, drifted like dust. One moment the maiden held a sword, the next she held a hilt with no blade. "Hey!" the maiden said. Elthrendil buried his blade in the side of her neck. The impact knocked the words out of the maiden's throat and replaced them with a surprised garble. She stumbled back, but Elthrendil was not finished. The Fae spun around and slammed his foot through the maiden's chest. It punched through ribs, flesh and bones before exiting out of her back. Then he said something. She thought it might have been the words "same time tomorrow," but could not tell for sure because as he pulled his leg out of her broken body, her teacher head-butted her. After that, she was granted blissful sleep. The maiden asked Ishin about the matter as they walked through paradise. All around them were rolling fields filled with angels training for war. They wore golden armor that shone in the ever-sun of this dimension. Paradise's fields were filled with golden grasses that blew from the constant, peaceful breeze. There wasn't often a breeze in Rose Hollow, so the maiden appreciated the novelty. She also privately admired how serene the dimension was compared to the city. There were always people talking or shouting back home. Not here, though. The loudest things here were mostly the songbirds, whose harmonic songs cascaded from the branches of the Tree of Dreams high above them. Amongst its golden leaves were birds of every colour. Their feathers created an iridescent shimmer, which the maiden found quite pretty. And that is how Elthrendil accomplishes his harmonization, Ishin said. "Do you understand?" "Oh," the maiden said, panicking. "I think so," Ishin smirked. "Maiden, it's okay if your attention wandered." "My attention didn't. Well, it did, but I asked the question and it's just that. The concept is pretty dry," Ishin said. "Most people don't want to hear about it." The maiden nodded politely. She wasn't really sure what Ishin meant by that either, because everything she ever said was fascinating, but the maiden didn't want to annoy her with more questions. Ahead of them, along the marble road in which they walked, two angels in gleaming armor passed by them. They gave the maiden strange looks, which was normal, but they were also interlocking their hands. She'd seen the custom in Rose Hollow, but didn't think much of it. If the angels of paradise were doing it, then perhaps it was more important than she thought. Why are they grasping each other's hands? The angels, the maiden clarified. That passed by us. They were holding on to each other. I've seen others in Rose Hollow do the same. What's it for? This seemed to make Ishin pause, something that the maiden noticed she was doing more lately around her. A sense of nervousness began to bubble up as she feared she was asking questions with very complicated answers that she was too naive to fully understand. "It's done by beings who are close with each other," Ishin said. Her words were measured and her tone was flat. The maiden noticed the goddess had her eyes firmly fixed on the horizon. "Oh," the maiden said and followed it with a sigh of relief. "Well, do you want to hold my hand then?" "Excuse me? Well, we're pretty close, aren't we?" "Yes," Ishin said, "that is true, but however, there is the matter of holding hands being inappropriate in public." "Really? But the angels?" "They have special permission." "Oh," the maiden said. Then a few seconds later she asked, "But why?" "To build morale." "Why does that build morale?" This line of questioning continued until the two reached their destination. The maiden was slightly panicked when they reached the Colosseum because Ishin's face was flush and she was sweating. The maiden kept on asking Ishin if she wanted to sit down, have a rest, or a piggyback ride, but she refused it all. That did not make the maiden any less worried. The temperature in paradise was perfect. Plus, was it possible for a high god to sweat? Was it possible for anybody to sweat in paradise? This was all very concerning and weird. What lay in front of her helped to preoccupy the maiden, though. The Colosseum of the high gods was a tremendous structure that rose out of the Paradise's rolling fields. Its walls, soaring hundreds of feet into the air, were made of pure, untarnished gold which shimmered in the ever-sun. Each block seemed impossibly massive, their surfaces smooth and warm, as though untouched by time. Gargantuan columns encircled the structure, their bases wider than the span of 5 men, etched with ancient symbols. The columns were crowned with jagged spires, reaching skyward, as if to emulate the branches of the Tree of Dreams. At the top of the walls, statues of angelic figures stood frozen in mid-battle, their faces locked in expressions of divine fury. Each statue held weapons of stone that gleamed like polished silver, casting long shadows across the arena below. As the maiden drew close, she saw the massive gates leading into the Colosseum were silver, embossed with intricate designs depicting scenes of an ancient celestial war and the glorious victory afterward. "This is where you meet?" the maiden asked in awe. "Once we filled this place," Ishin confirmed. "There was not a seat in this building that was not filled by our number. How many are you now? 87 as of today. Resolve was fractured by Neorax in Disseral yesterday. Oh, I'm sorry I asked. You didn't know, Ishin said. Besides, we cannot focus on that now. Our argument, method, and reasoning are all sound. We just need to convince my siblings of your plan. Our plan, the maiden corrected with a smile. Ishin paused, then nodded her head in agreement. Our plan, she confirmed. The maiden's face broke out into a smile that was quickly snuffed. There was a figure waiting outside the Colosseum, Quellion. Out of the corner of her eye, the maiden saw Ishin stiffen when she saw the angel. Ishin, Quellion said with a sweeping bow, your presence is expected inside. Your siblings wait for you. Ishin nodded, making a move to walk past the angel. However, the others wish Ataxia to wait outside. Her chosen name is the Maiden, Ishin said gently, head barely turning to acknowledge the ruiner's angel. My apologies, Ataxia just rolls off the tongue. You forget yourself, angel, Ishin said. The maiden felt the goddess draw power into her id. Around her the air seemed to ripple like water on a windy ocean. Quellion took a tentative step backward. Remember that immortality, Ishin continued, is a double-edged sword. Forever can be worse than oblivion with the right jailer. The maiden looked back to Quellion, who had gone pale. Deferentially, the angel bowed low. I shall do better, the angel said. Forgive my transgressions, goddess. There was a pause. Then I redeem you, Ishin said. She placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Quellion raised his head, met her eyes, and then quickly glanced down once again. Maiden, please remain here. I shouldn't be long. Then the air around Ishin was consumed in light, and the high god was no more. Only the faint buzzing of her power remained floating in the space. That also left the maiden awkwardly close to and alone with Quellion. A few brutal moments of silence passed between the two of them. Quellion picked his head up and stared past the maiden. The maiden tried desperately to not be stared through, but Quellion's eyes followed her wherever she wandered. Things could be worse, the maiden told herself. That thought was fleeting, though. She'd much prefer it if Ishin wasn't facing her siblings alone, and if Quellion wasn't staring at her like a piece of meat. However, rarely did she ever seem to get what she preferred. Have you been to a lot of these meetings? The maiden asked. She figured Ishin would at least try to talk to Quellion, so maybe she could do the same. Yes. Ah, well, this is my first one. I know. I'm very excited. I don't care. I mean, maybe you should, the maiden said. If all goes well, there's going to be more of me soon, or more people like me. Ether eaters. You could use that word, yes. But my point is that we want to start changing things for the better, and we will change things. Many try. My point is, the maiden said, exasperation leaking into her tone, that Ishin and I will succeed, so there will be more ether eaters who got the same help that I did. You're going to need to get over your hatred of us. This prompted a scoff from Quellion. The maiden frowned in response. I know that we've done terrible things, awful things, and those crimes cannot be atoned for overnight. Maybe even if I'm being honest, Quellion. But once we help these ether eaters, they're going to want to help too, just like me. So we have to stop fighting with each other. That will never happen, Maiden, Quellion said. The angel turned to face her, casting the shadow of his wings over her body. From the feathers, it seemed like mist seemed to drift in waves. The gods will never agree to your scheme. You don't know that for sure. Your kind slaughter ours. To bring more of you into our sanctum just so you can turn on us later is absurd. Nobody is going to turn on you, Quellion, the maiden replied. I am not going to turn on you. You might have fooled Ishin, but the rest of us know better. The other high gods know better. Your true colours will be revealed sooner or later. I wouldn't be here if the high gods believed that. You're here as an experiment, Quellion exclaimed. They want to see how long they can keep Ataxia contained. Perhaps they'll be able to keep you neutered and docile long enough to win this war and bring the traitors to heel. That's not what they think about me, the maiden said as her voice faltered. Before your kind, the high gods filled this place. There was peace on the rings of Meropis. Then you all broke what we had due to your pride. I still see that pride in you. Your form might have changed, but I can smell the pieces of fractured gods on you. Their final cries of agony as their beings were sundered from the world. Murder is your delight, monster. I have seen your work with my own eyes. You were made to destroy everything that we cherish, along with all that we are and could ever become. That was true then, and even if it isn't true now, it will be again. If you were given the chance, you would tear me apart. I wouldn't, the maiden exclaimed. At this point, she felt her chest tightening as the weight of Quellion's words fell upon her. A terrible headache had crept up on her. It felt like it was threatening to break her skull open. However, Quellion would not relent. It is all so obvious. You chose the broken high god to save you. Any other high god would finish you off or lock you away. Of course, it would be Ishin. Hey, what do you mean by broken? The maiden asked through the pounding pain in her head. At this, Quellian's face let loose the truth. He'd said too much. It is simply conjecture. I don't know what that means, the maiden said through gritted teeth. You can insult me all you want, but Ishin helps people. She makes sure the people of Rose Hollow are safe. She is the kindest woman I know. Ishin is the last person who deserves your nonsense. Do not describe the goddess as if she is a person. Keep talking about her as if she isn't one, and I'll show you why I'm not one. The maiden knew it was a bad idea when she said this because Quellian immediately flared his wings. The mist drifting off them increased from a trickle to a torrent. She heard the hiss of platinum as the angel drew his blessed blade. It was then that the maiden cursed Elthrendil for destroying her sword. She'd have to protect Ishin's honor with just her fists alone, which would probably get messy. Nicholas would be so angry that he'd have to wash more blood out of her clothing. Before the maiden took a step forward, the air changed. Warmth and peace spread through the area. As a hand touched her shoulder, Quellian sheathed his sword. The maiden turned around to see Ishin standing behind her. At first, a smile spread across the maiden's face, but it cracked quickly. Ishin was not smiling. She seemed distraught. I'm sorry that I was going to fight him, the maiden blurted out. They want to question you. The high gods? Yes, Ishin said quietly. We have to go. Is that a bad thing? The maiden asked as Ishin grabbed her by the hands. The goddess did not answer as she teleported herself and the maiden into the Colosseum. Inside, the arena stretched out in a perfect circle, its floor a mosaic of obsidian tiles and mithril dust that gleamed under the light of the ever-sun that hovered above. Rows upon rows of tiered seats spiraled upward, carved directly into the gold walls, their surfaces worn smooth by the passage of countless ages. The maiden couldn't make out much more than that because quickly she felt them. The high gods were here in this place, fully manifested aspects of infinity. Against her will, the maiden felt infinity touch her. Next to her, she even felt the true breath of Ishin's infinity. The high god threw off her eyed beside the maiden. All of her, the entire concept of Ishin, burgeoned into existence around the maiden. For the first time, the maiden learned the true scale of Ishin's beauty. She was everywhere and in the most beautiful things. Yet even as beautiful as she was, it was more than the maiden could bear. The maiden felt her skin evaporate. Her body buckled as the wave of reality and infinity hit her like a colossal fist, but the moment seemed suspended. Her arms were thrown violently backward, and her hair ignited in a brilliant cascade of green flames, each ember dancing slowly in the air before themselves being consumed by the wrath of 87 high gods. Within milliseconds, her bones cracked like porcelain, glowing with an otherworldly light, as layers of flesh disintegrated and peeled away in a swirl of ash. Yet she did not scream. Her mouth hung open, a silent gasp, frozen in a moment too brief to capture sound. This was the true horror of touching what could never be known. As the world around her dissolved, the maiden vaguely felt Ishin. Her great expanse tried to protect the maiden. Yet, even her shield was a sword. Her proximity was poison, and where once she was peace, she was now pain. Despite her efforts, Ishin could not shield the maiden. She was only one infinite being in a conclave of many. What was left of the maiden naively hoped to die. They would not let her die. They could not. This was their questioning of her in the only way they knew how. Something burned within her, and it kept her whole. Ishin surrounded her and kept her from being scattered across everything and nothing. It was all real and unreal. Somehow the maiden knew that she screamed despite having no mouth. Some pains transcend the need for a mouth. She felt her flesh burn the instant it regenerated. The maiden tried to stop it, but it didn't matter. All of this was deeper than flesh. Mere seconds passed for her in that place. Then, at the end of everything, she heard the whisper of the high gods. Their answer to her plea was clear. No. Next, Chapter 6. I have seen this universe.